Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the next episode of StreamTime Sports. My name is Chris Stone, the community lead, joined as always by our CEO, Nick Meacham. Now, Nick, I do have a segue today, so I need you to just trust me that I've got something that's going to lead us to the promised land. Do you trust me?
I always trust you, Chris. I always trust you.
Okay.
What have
All
you
right.
got for
Well,
me?
I'll get part of the way through, and you can tell me if we go the long route or the short route. But just to kick things off,
Okay.
our listeners who've been around, they know I used to coach the GB women's team, and when I got the head coaching role, as most people probably do, and they get a new job, they reach around to people to get information or to get insights, valuable lessons, things that they can take with them. So one of my old Wittenberg teammates, John Daniels, recommended a book to me, Nick, called Good to Great by Jim Collins. Now, John Daniels was a teammate of mine at Wittenberg, former Army member. He had served in Iraq, and great story, Nick. Great Netflix speech, which is going to be a great segue. We used to sit on the bus together to coach journeys because we studied the same courses. We were both a bit old guys, although he was 4 years older than me at the time. And he gave this speech that he was in Iraq and he was in a foxhole, but it wasn't his buddies out in Iraq with him. It was me and Swopey and Los and Hebe and like all the teammates. And I was like, man, that's some bad PTSD. So we ended up being in a playoff game. We were down 22 points in the second quarter. And basically at halftime, we were down 31-13. So we're just getting our butts kicked. And John comes in at halftime and gives this massive speech about, I had this dream last night that I was out at war and we were down the foxhole, da, da, da. And, just flips it around to that's where we're at right now. We're getting our asses kicked. We need to fight for our lot. And we came back, and it's still the largest comeback victory in Division III playoff history.
Wow.
So just a great speech from Mr. Daniels. But he recommended this book to me called Good to Great by Jim Collins. It has nothing to do with football, but I've built multiple presentations. I actually did my presentation to the CEO of BAFA on this. I've given a presentation at a coaches conference on this. Called The Principles of Greatness. But basically, Nick, the whole book by Jim Collins is he's actually a business professor. And basically the whole thing, Good to Great, is how do two businesses in similar places end up going into this box? What's in the box where one ends up great and one not so great? So one of the comparisons is Netflix versus Blockbuster. At one time, Netflix and Blockbuster were both similar businesses, similar tiers. One of them is now one of the biggest companies in the world. One of them now no longer exists. And they kind of go through and they look at these different companies that are similar and sort of talk about what's in the box, what makes good things become great. Now, I applied that to football, but we're going to talk about Netflix today, Nick. But I just want to recommend, if everyone's not read the book, Good to Great by Jim Collins, go read it. There's lots of really good stuff about leadership, company structure, building your USP. I applied it to football, but it's a great book, Nick, and it's a perfect segue to talk about Netflix because we are going to go back in history a little bit to talk about Netflix, but they have boomed as a business. So there's my segue, Nick, and I hope people enjoyed that story.
I enjoyed the story. I would love if you've done a presentation on this whole good to great thing. It's actually something I've been talking about recently on some of the stuff that we've been working on at Sports Pro. So I'd love to see with the presentation that you've done, if you can dust it off somehow and share it. But I'm writing down now, Good to Great book. I'm going to hit you up for that at some stage.
Yeah, by Jim Collins. But yeah, phenomenal book. I'll see if I can find it. It's been footballified, but I definitely think there's some things I can respin it for you, Nick, for a business perspective.
I can translate sports speak to business speak. No problem. Don't worry.
Absolutely. So I'll dig that out. But today, Nick, we are going to talk about Netflix. And just to give a little bit of context how we got to this point, you made a LinkedIn post the other day talking about Netflix has made a bit of an interesting deal for exclusive rights to CONCACAF's Gold Cup in Mexico from 2027. You then got a message reply from our friend Joe Redfern sending you some information about an article she wrote on Substack talking about the World Baseball Classic in Japan that was exclusively on Netflix. And it got us thinking this could be a really good topic to go down to talk about where Netflix is today, given some of the moves that have been happening, and then talk a little bit about fragmentation, because that's one of the I guess, key points in Joe's argument as we go through things talking about fragmentation. So it's just a really interesting place to talk about Netflix, Nick, because I remember when I joined the company, Netflix was in a completely different place to where it is today. And based on what they're doing with the Gold Cup in Mexico, what they're doing with World Baseball Classic, has you throwing up some flags to say, hey, people, traditional media, be paying attention, although they might already be paying attention, Nick?
Well, I think they're paying attention to Netflix, but this deal kind of flew under the radar, I think, a little bit for me. And I just think there's more of a signal or a statement of intent here that that the sports industry needs to pay attention to. Sometimes I think that, if it's not one of the big five leagues in the US, or it's not the Premier League or these obvious major rights holders, the deals that are being done, it can be just lost in the abyss of all the content that we get served these days. But I feel like this is a pretty important announcement or a deal, not only for the market that they're serving, in this case Mexico, but indeed what Netflix's future plans might be.
Well, before we get into that, Nick, we'll just set the scene a little bit. How do we actually got to this point? For a reminder for anyone that doesn't remember, I remember the golden days of going to Blockbuster, Nick. That was the sign of a good weekend. Friday night, you're going to rent a video game, rent a movie. It was a good time. Alongside that, a few years after, Blockbuster's been around a while, but in 1997, Netflix launched. It was originally a DVD by mail business. I remember some drive-thrus, at least in America, they had it in a drive-thru version. You could pick up a DVD.
Yeah.
In 2007, that pivoted to the streaming business. Now, initially, there was no live sports on there. There wasn't any live content at all, to be clear on that. The co-CEOs of the time, Reed Hastings and Ted Sarandos, repeatedly emphasized that Netflix prioritized global long-tail content with perpetual value. They viewed sports as being regionally locked. It was time-sensitive and incredibly expensive relative to its replay value. And I think it's one of the things we've talked about sports. Although archive footage is probably a little undervalued, it still loses a ton of value as soon as people know the results. There was a shift. Before that, it was them renting or leasing IP. Come 2013 began the era of Netflix originals. The House of Cards was the biggest series to really kick that off. And Netflix sort of tried to take on this thing of, could you be appointment viewing without necessarily, taking the exact cable model? And at the time, they didn't think that sports was necessary to drive growth, given how well they were seeing success from just being able to have the IP of streamable content. This sort of led the foundations of Reed Hastings' later statement around, we're not anti-sport, we're just pro-profit. So, Nick, kind of looking back at the history of Netflix, OTT really was just becoming mainstream at this point. Streaming as a thing was just starting to launch. So I don't think we could really blame Netflix for the kind of the first 10 years of its history for not necessarily getting involved in sports.
I think it was a pretty smart strategic decision at the time. And like you said, they basically were positioning themselves as a replacement for Blockbuster, not a replacement for cable. And, what was Blockbuster synonymous with? It wasn't sports content. It was entertainment related content. And that is evident, in their approach. And quite frankly, that means that their model and the maturity that they saw by being one of the first movers in market meant that they didn't need the premium sports, say, spike to get to scale that they might have if you're coming into market after there's been a lot of incumbents already in place, where Netflix was a first mover. And naturally, mainstreaming wasn't really mainstream enough at the time anyway, particularly if you think about the US as a focus, where those deals that are being done are normally built around advertising-led approaches. And ultimately, what you said before, they were a VOD business, a VOD business. They weren't a live streamer at the time. And at that time, 13 years ago or so, which actually feels longer ago, it's crazy to think it's only 13 years ago. That's a whole other set of technology that you need to develop. You can't just plug in live streaming on a global scale into a VOD product like it's nothing, especially back then. Now it's a little bit more easier than then. So look, I think I look back and reflect, and I think they took the right approach by waiting and being patient with sports. Otherwise, I think they would have spent a lot of money and probably had marginal results because their product was so unique and needle moving at the time. They just didn't need sports to get the momentum they crafted.
And I can remember you saying that we had, back when it was the Sports Pro, might have even still been the OTT Summit before it became Sports Pro Madrid, you and I did a power rankings of all the different broadcasters, and we sort of, gave them grades. And you actually gave Netflix a really high grade because they weren't trying to do sports. And at the time, you were actually, sort of to the consistent with what you've said here at the time, that probably was the right move for them because they didn't need to, didn't make sense for the business. So at least you're consistent on that, Nick, across the years.
At least I'm consistent on what I'm gibbering on about. But look, I think we're going to get to it a bit later on to what was the changing point, why they went into sports shortly. Yeah. But I do really believe that with the business model that they had in place, which was at that time was just subscription retention and acquisition alone, there just wasn't enough economics in there to make it worthwhile for them. instead of spending on premium non-live IP. Though once they shifted course, it made a lot more sense in the future. But yeah, at the time I was pretty adamant about I like their model, and I still think they took the right approach, quite frankly, because I think if they went too early, you look at some of the debts and some of the amount of money that's been lost over the years between all the major streamers. They did lose a lot of money to begin with, but it didn't take much for them to turn the tide because they didn't have sports as that overhanging cost attached to them.
Well, as you talk about changes, I personally don't think this was the change, but I think some people credit it a little bit, Nick, where I guess what you could say was a significant moment for Netflix in regard to its relationship with sports was in 2018 when it began production on the first season of Drive to Survive, which then went on to be aired in 2019, which actually, Nick, coincides with my first year at Sports Pro. I joined the business maybe only a few weeks before the Sports Pro Fan Conference, which we hosted at the new Tottenham Stadium at the time. And that was the really big section when we had Box to Box and F1 on to talk about that series. And that was brand new. So, Nick, that was my first ever Sports Pro event talking about that.
I love that session because I got a chance to speak to Ian Holmes and Paul Martin at the time. I forgot all about that session. And that was just, I think they just kicked off the second season. And one of the little anecdotes they shared was they had to start recording season 2 of Drive to Survive before they even had a deal in place with Netflix. So they had to take a bit of a risk. They were just banking on the success and banking that they would have got a deal done in time. But they took a massive leap of faith to take their entire army of producers, editors, etc., down to Melbourne and start recording, holding their fingers and crossing their fingers and toes that Netflix would agree. And sure enough, they did. And the rest is history.
It is very much history and a big part of it. Netflix managed to enter in sports, and I think probably its most meaningful way, but managed to do it in a way that didn't require them to own rights. They were able to do it through its own original IP. The series obviously has been given a lot of credit for growing the audience of Formula One, particularly in the US. And I think probably the lesson for Netflix at the time was sports culture is valuable, but sports rights are probably still optional. And we saw, Nick, that they then went on to kind of replicate that docuseries process. They had things like Breakpoint with tennis, Full Swing with golf. We also saw in that period some really great documentaries like The Last Dance featuring Michael Jordan. So that was a really big, I think, period of years of them sort of building up a little bit more relationship with the sports world, Nick, now. But I have my opinion, which is, given what we're going to talk about next and what's currently at, where they're currently at with their strategy, how much do you think Drive to Survive actually impacted their live sports strategy?
Look, I think they might have learned a few things about but not from necessarily the consumption on their platform. Look, it was great content. It was novel and new in the same way entertainment content can be novel and new, and that can really move the needle in terms of consumption. And I think if you look at some of the data they've shared since, Drive to Survive has been by far one of its best investments from a content perspective that it's ever had. I actually think what might have drawn interest is really just the engagement and audience momentum it created for F1 and the impact it had on just consumption and fandom around those sorts of sports moments and properties. That clearly was something that you don't often get for other titles of content and entertainment. Naturally, there is some of that, but the way it could move huge amounts of people right across the globe was so impressive for them, and must have made them take stock that there's something in that sports space. But even after the success of that, they were adamant up until really quite recently that they like being in that sort of sweet spot there of storytelling around sports, but that doesn't mean they need to be investing in live sports. And that was definitely clear in the approach they made up until only a few years ago.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Nick. I think it was massively successful. I don't think it necessarily has a ton to do with their live sports strategy, which I think the next thing, if we're following the timeline, probably accelerated, I think maybe has more credit to that, is which took place in April 20th, 2022, which is where for the first time in a decade, Netflix reported its first subscriber loss. Its shares plummeted 35%, losing $54 billion in market cap in a single day. I mean, we're just talking absolutely ridiculous numbers, Nick. And I can remember StreamTime as a podcast was quite new at the time, but this is a topic that we covered. You know, it wasn't necessarily sports specific at all, but we were talking about it because the strategy, I think, of Netflix at the time was growth at all costs, get as many subscribers as possible. And we had seen some people like a DAZN adopting this strategy with the way they were acquiring sports rights and just all in on getting subscribers at any cost. And the moment that Netflix, all of a sudden, there was a weakness in that business model of growth via subscription, was a real wake up call. And I guess, Nick, do you remember when we covered that story? And I guess the impact that it had, not just for Netflix, but the broader sports media landscape and just the way trends were going with subscription services?
Yeah, I remember it really well. I think I ended up just nerding out on all the finance numbers that were
Yeah.
shared to try and get my head around what was going on. I think even posted something on a few different channels that it kind of blew up
Yeah.
as well. But it was trying to get my head around what does this all mean, and the knock-on effect was really to the entire streaming industry as a result of that. Indeed, probably the entire media ecosystem, because valuations of businesses were slashed. The industry went from a growth market almost instantly to a mature market that didn't have the momentum behind it that it needed, because Netflix were the flagship of the new era of streaming.
Yeah.
And that meant with the multiples changing, companies weren't allowed to lose money anymore, like in the way they were, and had to shift that focus from growth really to profitability. And that was a big shock to the system, to the entire industry, not least Netflix. And then, of course, they couple that announcement with the launch of an ads tier pretty shortly after. Brought in Microsoft to help with their tech stack development, programmatic advertising incorporated into that model, which incidentally I think was a bit of a weird partner and not surprisingly didn't work out. But I think it's one of those tech partnerships where Microsoft wanted to put their flag in the ground, basically as a player in the programmatic space, since all the other major tech companies have been doing so. But their move to ad tiers, I think, really catalyzed, was a catalyst, I should say, was a catalyst for the rest of the industry to start leaning harder into ads on their platforms, and naturally also made it more viable to start looking at live sports.
Yeah, and we'll talk about more advertising later. I think to your point that is key, and we've talked about advertising so much in ad tech in recent episodes that we've covered. But specifically, looking at the sports space again, how that impacted things from a media rights perspective, because I think to your point, Nick, one of the reasons why sports are so attractive is its ability to drive advertisers, and just it seems like that sparked things. And at the same time, Nick, one of the words you used is profitability. I don't think I'd heard anyone really talk about profitability until that moment. And then that was the moment where everything, all the conversations seemed to change that we were having at events, where it went from how do you acquire some subscribers to, okay, how do we make it all about profitability? That seemed to just send ripples across the industry and just the way people were talking about things from my memory at our events.
Well, I think the timing, if you think about the conversations we've had around people like Fubo TV that were listed on the stock exchange, that had a massive bump through COVID. Remember that crazy shareholder? There was a name for it, where basically they got a huge valuation increase because everyone just started buying their shares because of basically a bunch of creators talking about it. I can't remember. It went like to a few $100s a share. We've talked to David Gandler over the subsequent years as well. But one of the things that happened to a business like them, I remember very clearly, is it went the narrative around them shifted so fast, and it became about how quickly can they become profitable and how much money they got to lose before they go broke. Basically, was the kind of the message. And companies like them, sure enough, have crafted their path, but it just changed the entire perception of the market. It's amazing, just because of one company's less than solid numbers changed the entire way the industry faces was basically structured, I guess, in terms of the investment, the finances, and indeed the monetization approach behind it. But it did open up the can of worms for advertising, which has made it much more profitable for a lot of advertisers to, for a lot of streamers to basically build out their streaming portfolio.
Yeah, well, as you said, following that, one of the responses was to open up a tier or a ad tier model. But one of the things that also happened in that subsequent year, really two things. One of which was Reed Hastings stepped down as co-CEO, which causation correlation. There was a new sort of approach and strategy, but also we saw for the first time Netflix dip its toes into live sports, where it had its Netflix Cup, which was a crossover event with Formula One drivers and PGA Tour players, which aligns with the two docuseries that they were putting together. And one of the things that came out from Ted Sarandos, operating now as the sole CEO, was talking about breakthrough moments rather than schedules. Netflix stating it will pursue one-off or limited run events or sports with outsized engagement spikes, which again seems to align with this new advertisement. I don't want to say approach, but openness to monetizing through those manners. And then the following year in 2024, Netflix went on to acquire exclusive rights to the NFL Christmas Day games. anybody knows anything about the NFL, if we're talking about appointment viewing, there is nothing bigger in U.S. media than the NFL. It also is consistent with what we just talked about, where it avoided that long-term weekly schedule, but it did guarantee a cultural moment. And Netflix confirmed later on that retention matched up as well for these events as it did for their top original scripted programs. So I guess, Nick, given this new direction, understanding the need to diversify its revenue beyond just streaming and looking at advertising, it feels a little bit like sports was inevitable. And that first event was, I guess, very predictable because it was very low risk. It was no big deal. But was it perhaps interesting to you that the first thing they dipped their toes into is straight into the NFL?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how you want to look at it, right? Because I think their first toe dip, so to speak, was really stuff that you just briefly touched on, which was they started launching their own live events. If you think about the different stuff they tried to build up basically almost a full ecosystem of their own events that they operated themselves. You're talking hot dog eating competitions, the pro-ams with F1 drivers and players, boxing matches,
there's
exhibition.
a dating show too, right? Like Love is Blind, or there's some sort of dating show.
They definitely got the rights to. They broadcast live one of the finales. I think that's what it was. I'll pretend like I don't know what I'm talking about there, but I watched that. No, but I did. I remember it crashed. I think was one of the big storylines because they were going live with that at the time. Yeah. But they even did that exhibition match in Vegas between like Rafael Nadal and Carlos Alvarez, and so they tried to basically become events business, owning the entire ecosystem and leaning into basically entertainment rather than going into the legacy of sports. And clearly, from what we've seen since, they must have learned a thing or two about the challenges of launching events, monetizing those events, and maybe just the headaches of doing all of that. So why not just go into buying rights here and there and keeping all the legwork and focus just on delivery and monetization, which is clearly is what they've decided to really lean into of late.
And we saw some of the numbers from Netflix in terms of, selling out all their advertisement space for those games. So clearly those oversized moments make sense. But even evolving on from Netflix, we saw at the start of 2025, which feels forever ago, but it really isn't. They entered into a 10-year deal with the WWE for Raw. That made it kind of the first time they had a long-term commitment. I guess the benefit, or one of the things to talk about the WWE, is sort of twofold. Steve McCaskill will get upset about this. It is more entertainment than sport necessarily. It also
how dare you, Chris?
I know.
How dare you?
It also comes with a whole heap of archive content. The WWE platform moved into Netflix, so it's kind of a multifaceted deal with that. But it did represent, I think, the first time that they went and made a long-term commitment. And now they're doing these little things, Nick, where we talked about at the start of things. There's the Jake Paul, Mike Tyson fight. More recently, there was the Canelo versus Crawford fight. And then the one you mentioned was the CONCACAF hosting the Gold Cup on Netflix directly in Mexico. So Nick, kind of now going all the way from the beginning as a DVD service to where they're at now, mixing in their live entertainment with live sports. We've teased it. We've talked about it. Why now, after all these stories, does the Gold Cup story stick out to you about what you wrote about on LinkedIn?
Well, look, the thing that you picked up on is those different examples you shared. They were almost all massive exclusive deals and also global deals, right? Big global reach and visibility across all of Netflix's platforms, all included in the subscription product, which was a nice deal, but global. This is not the first because they've done some stuff in Japan, which we'll talk about in a bit, but this is really one of the first moves that we've seen. And well, the second step outside of the US for single market deals, where they are focusing on single territory premium live rights in that market, particularly around sports. And so that feels significant because if this is just it looks like just a starting point for them, it's logical that they would continue to expand their localized approach market by market wherever makes sense. Otherwise, I don't really see them just focus on North America and Japan. It feels a bit of a limited approach. And Mexico is interesting to me because we've talked about the strength and competition that exists in that market when we had David Sandlin from Tubi on talking about their moves, in particularly around sports rights in that market. So it became inevitable to me that this is just a stepping stone. It feels a bit inevitable, basically, that this is just the starting point, and you're going to continue to see them looking at maybe not necessarily the alpha A1 rights packages just yet, but they're certainly looking at rights that move the needle enough to gain either cultural value, and definitely advertising revenue, let alone the acquisition piece, which is always at play.
Well, for example, no one ever picked up the Christmas games in the UK from Amazon after they left, maybe those sorts of things. Or we've talked about, could La Liga ever carve something out where they could have a global deal for El Clasico between, Real and Barcelona, where the rest of the games go to their normal broadcasters, but that is a one-off game. Could that be that big moment for Netflix where maybe that is the thing to potentially help some of these European leagues that are struggling to drive more money for broadcast? Could they potentially carve out packages like that, Nick?
Well, that was the Champions League. We're looking at that model with, I think it was the opening match of the season as well. Amazon. And there was rumors that Amazon or a major streamer was going to pick that up. But I don't think that specific like event style offering a rights package, which clearly looked like it was targeted towards a Netflix, basically got picked up by Netflix. I think it basically stayed with was sold and distributed through those other means. And you're always going to have this tension between, Apple was adamant about global only deals at the beginning. Netflix historically were, until historically I say, but within 2 years. And now there's a shift to the single market. I think you're going to see more and more of it from here.
And who's happy about that?
Who's happy about it? Well, I tell you, the rights owners are definitely happy about it because it means that there's one serious competitor where money isn't the problem. It's just whether or not the value is there. Yeah. That's quite a significant situation. Instantly means that there is a player in every market that can be leveraged in some way or shape or form, whether that is them just saying that Netflix is up for it, or whether they actually are bidding and pushing up the rights values in the respective markets for some of the content. I'm sure I'm going to hear from some rights owner in the next 12 months telling me they're hearing that Netflix is in for some sort of rights because they want to try and drive up interest and attention. And I wouldn't blame them either. I think there's also some value for fans, consumers. Again, it all depends on market dynamics. But if given the maturity of Netflix, I'm not going to call it free to air, but it's the next tier underneath. It has so mature an audience set in a lot of main Western markets that being on Netflix is a bit of a win, a draw card. It means you got access instantly to a huge audience set, and it's not hidden behind a supplementary package premium like you do see on most of the major pay TV providers. So I could see that being a win in certain markets. I could also see it being a massive problem in a lot of others.
Yeah. Well, like I said, off the back of that post you made, Nick, Joe commented with some stuff that she said would be interesting to look at from the World Baseball Classic that took place in Japan. And that was exclusively broadcast on Netflix. Now, she put some really great analysis and statistics on this. So again, this is the World Baseball Classic that just occurred last month. No free-to-air broadcaster, no simulcasting or secondary platform. Some of the statistics in terms of performance had 31 million viewers across the tournament. Japan versus Australia became the most watched ever title on Netflix Japan.
Random.
Impressive statistics. Netflix share of total streaming hours jumped from roughly 60% to 80% during the World Cup. So to Joe's point, when you remove fragmentation, it actually sort of absorbed consumption as opposed to letting things spread out, and daily viewership increased more than 400% in terms of how many hours people spent on the platform during those periods. So some really, really big numbers in terms of, all the different metrics you'd want to see, from engagement rates to concurrent viewers to overall share of market. And again, Nick, it seems like a fairly good success story for Netflix on the face of it in terms of what they were able to drive through those metrics, having that exclusive, specific market-led approach for something, because it's worth noting the World Baseball Classic, the way English people love English football, Japanese people love baseball, and you've got Shohei Ohtani. Like, it's a massive thing for them to be able to really dive into this very specific, big, major event play.
Definitely. I think it was an interesting move for a few reasons, but one is basically because Japan's an interesting market. It's a really big market in scale. We've seen DAZN try heavily in that market to stamp their flag in the ground, which was their first major move for those that were following, was into the J League in Japan out of nowhere. That was their very first move. And what I didn't know, I haven't really followed that story too closely in the last couple of years. I did earlier on. And what has been interesting to see is a bit of the reaction that I've stumbled across on platforms like Twitter, where I think I posted the stuff that I wrote, and people were saying that basically normally the WBC has historically been a free-to-air product, and I haven't looked into the numbers of like how streaming adoption is in general terms in Japan, but it was not met so positively for it to go into the Netflix ecosystem, which perhaps suggests that Netflix isn't as strong in Japan as it maybe is in other markets. And maybe that's why one of the reasons why they decided to make this move and try and create a bit of inertia behind themselves in that market, basically using sports as an acquisition tool. And naturally, these things, if it's a disruption in the way people are consuming, does have will always be met with a negative reaction if it is a disruption to the way they're used to, and it seems to be the case, a bit of that case. But people forget that stuff quickly if it ultimately sticks and makes and is something that they are comfortable with in the longer term.
So I think one of the thesis that Joe came up with, and I hope I'm not putting words in her mouth, was around the idea of when you remove fragmentation, the way people can then take ownership at that moment. Because one of the other things Netflix did is they, for the first time ever, had a creator program to build shoulder content around that and really build the experience around the World Baseball Classic to really kind of be this all-encompassing thing. And I guess, Nick, when we're talking about this case of fragmentation, is this something you think holds weight? Or do you think this is something that only someone like a Netflix would have the ability to perhaps be able to achieve? How unique could this strategy work? Because you just mentioned like it didn't quite work for DAZN very well. Is just how much of this is down to the strategy of Netflix versus Netflix is just such a unique business that they could pull this off that maybe someone else couldn't?
I think others could as well. Netflix is just so much capital behind them, resource. They can do what they like, and they can make it a success to a certain extent. I think so. I don't think there was ever a concern about that. But I think when you're disrupting the traditional ways that content is consumed, we've seen it in other markets. It will be met negatively by certain audiences. I don't know if DAZN and the J League has not worked. I do know they had to renegotiate the deal after a number of years. I heard that maybe that's because it wasn't doing as well, but I've not looked into. I have no knowledge of the marketplace at this time, which is probably something I should look into actually, just to see what is the latest, and maybe see if there's anyone if anyone's listening in Japan wants to give us a bit of an update on this. Give us some more insight if you can. But look, I think Netflix can. I guess looking at what Netflix did here and that creator stuff that you mentioned, it's making them act more like a traditional, I use in inverted commas, traditional streamer or broadcaster, rather than what they were trying to do with sports earlier on, which is be an events business. And that just makes a lot more sense, really. They're trying to ultimately funnel people to one destination alone, rather than trying to drive revenue from a whole host of different areas that isn't as easy as it sounds. So they're never going to be able to own the WBC because it's something that is owned by the federation. But this is a nice step for them to I guess just widen the net and the visibility, because they were definitely trying to push acquisition is clearly the focus when you lean into the creators. That's obviously what they're trying to do, is funnel people into the main platform.
Well, one of the things Joe tried to wrap this up in was a conversation around fragmentation, which is where we'll kind of wrap things up ourselves, kind of talking about fragmentation is ultimately good for the seller because more packages, more bidders equals higher rights fees. But ultimately, fans are the ones that have to pay the cost for that. And what she, at least my interpretation of it, she can correct me if I'm wrong, was kind of talking about when you have a single home for something, you can build a unique experience that's built for the fans. And essentially, the current model is designed for the sellers. It's not designed for the fans on the other end. And basically, Netflix sort of demonstrated there is a way that you could build something that's more fan specific with that less fragmented approach. Now, Nick, I'm going to go on a little soliloquy here. I think industry, I think the industry needs to stop using the word fragmentation so much. I believe that it is a red herring. The example that gets used quite a bit, Joe used it in hers. It's a little outdated because some of those companies have changed names or aren't involved anymore. The example is always the Premier League has a fragmentation problem. You have to pay a subscription to Sky, TNT, and Amazon. What the issue is how much it costs. I don't think the issue is that you have to go to three different channels. I think if you replace
Mm.
those names with the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, and you made it free to air, nobody would complain that that's a fragmentation issue because there's three products. I think the real question or the real word we should be using is accessibility, not fragmentation. And I think fragmentation is kind of used as a shield to maybe not want to discuss that there's less of an appetite for fans to pay for the content and that it's becoming really expensive. Like I said, I just think fragmentation is not the word we should be using. Instead, we should be talking about accessibility.
Interesting. Yeah, I'd say I would agree with that. I think there's a bit of nuance in there. So the way when I look at fragmentation, and the examples that you shared, I think the tricky part of that is fragmentation would mean that you have to go into different apps and platforms, right,
Yeah.
to consume the content. When it's on the BBC or in linear channels, you literally just press a button and scroll
Yeah.
down to the next channel, and you might stumble across that content. So in some ways, you could say it's fragmented across channels, but it's aggregated into one distribution mechanism, which is free to air TV. That I don't think is quite the same thing, versus also the not only the fragmentation between different platforms like Sky and alike, but also the fact you've got to sign up 3 different times. It's a very friction heavy experience. Whereas I would love the model to just blow up. In Sweden, this is a bit of a weird example, but in Sweden, when you drive on toll roads, or where you we have our kids at school, we get charged for like after school care and school care and things like that. We just get invoiced and get a bill that we just press accept to pay every month. We don't have to sign up to anything. It just automatically comes because the government regulates it and organizes it all. I haven't had to think about what package I want. I just charge for what we use. And I just think, what if sports had that approach in place? And basically, live sports, you get invoiced every month, auto debit or direct debit, if you want, whatever you want to call it. You just get charged for how much you've consumed for the month. I would be way more interested in that. In fact, I would happily pay way more as a premium, because like things like the Masters, right? Yes, like this last month, I wanted to watch it, but the only option to watch it, particularly here and particularly illegally, was to sign up to Viaplay for like, I think for a 6-month package worth equivalent of like, $60 a month. I'm like, I just want to watch the Masters. Can you just make it one click and I'm in? And I'd pay more. I did this in the UK. I paid a stupid amount through Now TV, but I did it because I just wanted to get access to what I wanted. That is what I think, to bringing down the friction, driving an Amazon-like experience to either buy with one click, which I know others have tried, like OneFootball on Amazon, or just invoice me at the end. That would, I think, change the dynamic. But I have found, I noticed this fragmentation thing is, we still need to have a standardized universal operating system where everything is aggregated universally, so I can find sports on a whim. At the moment, I don't have that on my TV, and that's creating, I get lost in the abyss of all these platforms. So I do think fragmentation is an issue. Availability is also an issue. I think that there's a lot of crossover, but I think there's a bit of differences between them.
There is some difference. I think one of the things that popped up in my mind was thinking about the UFC. The UFC's not necessarily had a fragmentation issue. It's a little annoying, to your point. You had to have an ESPN Plus subscription to then go download it, but you only had to do the one thing. And then I think I mentioned you, there were some really funny memes when the UFC finally switched over to Paramount Plus of people being like, pretending to get wine from a Somali and being really fancy and be like, oh, it's nice to legally watch UFC for the first time, because all of a sudden, instead of paying $80 for a fight, you only had to pay for a $7.99 a month subscription, which is sort of where I'm coming from, in the sense of that accessibility thing that, the cost of things is, I think, possibly, in my opinion, more detrimental than the number of channels. Now, I agree with you, Nick. I would love to just have one experience where it would just charge me at the end. I think sometimes it's I think we like to use fragmentation because sometimes we're a little bit scared to talk about how expensive things are for the fans.
Well, there's a couple of things there. I agree with you. I'd say the couple of things are there's nuance, which is there's always nuance, isn't there?
Always.
I would say
That's why
the
this
couple
is
of things
fun.
are, yeah. A dirty little secret with the subscription industry. No one knows this, but basically these businesses and these business models are basically built on being funded by people that aren't going back to the platforms as
Yeah,
well.
true.
You'll never hear them talk about it, but there is a strong percentage of people that have subscribed and just don't consume the content much anymore and just get charged and don't think about it.
Yeah.
And the thought of stepping away from that revenue is probably a little bit frightening for some organizations as well. So that is a little bit of a challenge around the subs business world is you have this sort of passive income coming in that may or may not be connected with what service you're providing, and you can just kind of get away with getting free money in the bank. So I can't remember what my other point was.
We were talking about
what
the UFC.
Yeah, the UFC. Well, that one's a natural journey, right? Like, okay, I've been paying $80 a month. You're now telling me I can get this for $8. It's a nice, easy thing to articulate. But most of the examples that we will look at have gone the other way around. Like going from pay-per-view to a monthly subscription model is nearly non-existent across the industry. It's all been for free on free to wear. Now we've got to pay something which I wasn't paying before to get access to it. And that's a trickier thing to digest. But I do think like the Viaplay example I gave, there is just now so many examples where I am seeing that they have premium content. I'm almost ready to buy a subscription, almost, but I'm still holding out because like, well, I've got access to, Prime, Netflix, SVT, TV4, my Samsung TVs, fast channels. And like, I've just got so much content that I struggle to justify that investment. And to your point about the cost of content, that's the conundrum again. It's like, yeah, I know I can get premium stuff over there, but I can get a lot of other stuff here that I'm already getting either for free or already paying for. Why do I want to pay even more? And that is that tricky conundrum of it all. But one day we're gonna fix it, Chris. One day.
One day. But just speaking of fragmentation, some of the counterpoints, the arguments, some would say fragmentation helps increase reach, Nick. Although discoverability makes things easier, sometimes that means only the people that really are looking for you are going to find you. Whereas if you have a bit more of a fragmented approach, you have a better chance of people discovering your content. So that's always we've talked about this before, sort of discoverability versus fragmentation. Those kind of back and forths. Like, yes, it's really great that the MLS has an exclusive deal on Apple, but that means only people that are really looking for it are going to go find it. And the argument that fragmentation helps, do you buy that? How much, how much weight do you put on that argument that, fragmentation helps with reach? Or is that just something people say to make it sound better to justify?
Well, our favorite word, stumbleability,
Stumbleability.
which is definitely not a word. I think there's two audience segments there, right? One is the people that do just stumble across it, like basically looking around, trying to see what else to watch. And, that looks interesting. I might put that on for a few minutes. The other day I put on paddle and, what is that racing on the water? E1 it's called, I think, with like Tom Brady owns a team.
Oh, fair.
That was on I think it was on DAZN or something. So I was right, well, I'll have a look and check it out. But I mean, again, it's this whole conundrum of like, it quickly went to my second screen experience where I was on my phone within a couple of minutes and having it in the background, or I was doing some work on my laptop and then had just in the background to have half a ear out for something interesting to happen. And I definitely just feel like the way sports is getting consumed now is a very eclectic in that way. So, I don't know. I think there's people that look for this stuff actively. They know where to go, and there's people that just stumble across it. I would love to get some numbers on the dynamic there.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think most people are probably looking for it. But again, one of the other arguments, Nick, if we're going to try to talk about the fragmentation, is that it keeps prices sustainable in the sense of, from a market perspective. We've talked about one of the problems in Europe, perhaps, is there are no multiple competitors, Nick. They could probably do with a little bit more fragmentation. Competition helps, drive revenues. And as revenues go up, the more you can potentially offer fans or potentially, go more free to air, the NFL, like I said, Nick, not saying that's the argument for me. I'm just simply saying there are people out there that would say fragmentation is good for business because competition is healthy in a marketplace.
Again, yeah, from the rights owner's perspective, there's no doubt that fragmentation is good for business. I still think there is a model, there is a formula where fragmentation can be really good for you. But I think if it's equal fragmentation, so you have equally fragmented rights across a few different platforms, that's where you can lose people. I think you need to have at least one flagship where people go, right, if I buy that, then I definitely have access to enough that I need. But if I really want more, then I can sign up to those other services. I think I'm much more likely to do that, at least to know that take that first step, I suppose. Whereas if equal rights are split across different partners, I'd probably just like, where do I start? You know what? I'm just going to give up and move on. And that's the tricky conundrum, because that decision's not always on the rights owner. Obviously, it's also on the streamers, what they're willing to buy, what they're willing to spend, the interest levels, the needle moving nature of the sport. There's a lot of X factors to go into what ultimately the approach that's been taken by rights owners to sell their rights and look for rights partners, and how much they can turn that visibility into direct income through sponsorship sales. This prop platforms like Formula E that have been built on reach over revenue from rights, and then double down on that partnership visibility and storytelling for companies that want to position themselves alongside either motorsport or sustainability stories or electrical technology. That is a very different playbook. Also can be successful, again, depending on what your North Star and what your ultimate goal and objective is. So it's tricky.
Well, it's interesting because sponsorship is one of the other things that says is a positive for fragmentation. Sponsors want as many eyeballs as possible. If you are exclusive, I think, Nick, we would say in general, I mean, this is my personal opinion, typically the more fragmented you are, yes, it could be more of a headache, but you could have a larger scale of reach. Sponsorship is one of the arguments for fragmentation, is that it actually becomes more attractive for advertisers because there's more potential eyeballs to be seen as opposed to being with an exclusive sponsor. As you say, I think some events will be different. Someone like the Masters, where it's really short burst, having that might be different than someone that's a full length season. But sponsorship was one of the counter arguments where fragmentation is a positive.
Well, I've seen a lot of decks in my time, and you'll see what they'll put in. They put in those decks that they'll say that, we reached 50 million people for this content because they had it in 3 different platforms, and they're talking about potential household reach rather than actual numbers. People like to tell little stories with their numbers and make it, we see that constantly, or like every day with data points you see coming out. And that's inevitably why fragmentation works, because they can basically aggregate those numbers and make it a much bigger number because there's so much crossover of audience. They can just say that they've aggregated a lot bigger number than, the sum of all of its parts is worth a lot more than the actual reach itself that they've achieved. So I'm not surprised. It definitely would help. And I think there is some successful cases, but just not from the sponsorship lens, not at the top tier of sports. It's always the tiers underneath that have prospered best with that.
Now, the last thing I'll wrap up with, Nick, is one of the points that came up in Joe's analysis. I'm curious to know where you fall on this, because I probably fall a little bit different to her, is when you have a fragmented experience, fans then have a fragmented viewing experience, because every platform is going to be a little different. No 2 experiences are the same. It's hard to build sort of that maybe community vibe because you're always jumping around a little bit. And if you had more exclusive deals, all the other pros that you talked about would be true, but also now you could build really more of a fan first led experience where the platform is really built around them. I suppose where I fall a little bit different on this, Nick, is I don't know how much fans actually care. I think fans just want to watch sports. And while...
How dare you?
I know. And I appreciate when there's cool interactive features. I'm a fantasy nerd. I like having data, presented to me and things like that. I think the thing is, Nick, like I'm going to go back to piracy. You know how much I love piracy. You go to Twitter at 3 p.m. on a Saturday, you can pretty easily find people saying, hey, where's a link for such and such games? Like, I don't think people would it be nice to have a good experience? Yeah, I'm sure. But I think for most people, they really just want the content. And they might say that they prefer the ITV commentators for the World Cup over the Channel 4 commentators, the BBC commentators. I just don't know how much fans really ultimately care about some of that stuff. Maybe that's just me, my personal viewing experience, Nick. But I don't know if the idea of exclusivity allows you to build a user-first experience. For me, Nick, I don't know if it's quite that big of a deal. That's just my take on it.
Yeah,
maybe I'm old.
I'm trying to think. Well, you are aging yourself quickly you're talking about the way you consume sports.
Well, my birthday's tomorrow, so I'm 1 year older.
Yeah, that's true. Look, I think there's inevitably legs in this, but I think we've seen this over the years. Like how much value can be created from this type of increased experience, and I think that's the bit I struggle with. I'm sure you can provide immense value for a segment of your target audience, but it won't be universal. And I think that's the tricky bit: is you could spend a lot of time creating these personalized experiences that might just fall short on some people, but the cost will continue to go down. The technology will continue to get better, and maybe that will make a different experience. But yeah, I mean, anecdotally, when I watch stuff on different streaming platforms, I don't actively have the remote in hand ready to try and look at some data points and so forth. I either have it on, and I'm more likely to be on my phone in hand, looking at second screening that way, or whatever you define as a second screen. Sometimes the second screen is the TV, and sometimes it's the phone. It depends on what is on. And I've got those traditional my go-to platforms that I use on a day-to-day that I might engage with. So I think if you want to usurp them and you want to like try and take more of that real estate, and you can add something that is really going to grab yours and my attention whilst watching something that I enjoy and really want to engage with, that is really exciting if someone can pull it off. But I just think it's more difficult than it sounds.
Yeah, I agree. It makes me almost think of Aura. Do you remember our friend Ant
of
down in
course.
Australia with the platform they were building? I mean, I probably would have dived into that a little bit, but again, that's not necessarily worked out specifically in the sports space. And I don't think it has anything to do with the technology. The technology looked great, but I think to your point, just how much value can extract from those things?
Yeah, completely. I think like if I built a man cave at my house where I could just put on the TV, blacked out walls, no one interrupting me, and maybe the internet connection didn't work, then I might start getting a bit more twitchy with my like what's on the screen and maybe engaging with it more. But I loved what Aura was trying to do in terms of making more of a engaged, personalized experience. You're building the platform in a video game engine to try and make it much more interactive. But again, I just think there's obviously different audiences that I want lean back versus lean in experiences. You're not going to serve everyone, and that's the conundrum media has, is how do you provide a product that is good, at least good enough to all people to pay what is quite a low cost in general for content access. That's again the tricky conundrum, but hopefully we're going to solve it over the coming years, Chris, and everyone's going to love more engagement with pro platforms rather than those big tech bullies that keep eating the streamers and other content players lunch.
Absolutely. Well, everyone, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Nick, it was a pleasure to go down memory lane with Netflix and remembering the Blockbuster days. And like I said, I'll give you that deck on Good to Great.
Good stuff. Great to chat with you always, Chris. Thanks, everyone.